The most feared prisons in Canada: Millhaven, Kingston, Edmonton Max. The dark history of Canada's most notorious prisons. The prison gates slam shut, the air grows thick with tension. The cold concrete walls whisper the stories of countless lives shattered by violence, betrayal, and fear. You could almost feel the weight of their silence, the unspoken trauma trapped within. For many, these are simply names: Millhaven, Kingston, Edmonton Max. But for those who've spent time behind bars, they are the stuff of nightmares. These aren't just prisons. They are institutions of fear, where even the toughest inmates shake at the thought of stepping inside. The history, the people, and the events that have unfolded within these walls have made them infamous across the country and beyond. Millhaven, known for its cold, ruthless reputation, has housed some of Canada's most dangerous criminals. Kingston Penitentiary, which stood as a monument to punishment for over 170 years, was the setting for unimaginable brutality. And then there's Edmonton Max, a facility so harsh, it was called hell on earth by those unlucky enough to serve time there. It all starts in Kingston, where the story of Canada's darkest prisons begins. Kingston Penitentiary, the original nightmare. The year was 1835 when Kingston Penitentiary first opened its imposing gates. A symbol of punishment and suffering, this was the facility where Canada's worst criminals were sent to rot. It was designed to break people, to crush their spirits and force them into submission. And for over a century, it did exactly that. Located on the shores of Lake Ontario, its bleak stone walls towered over the city, casting a shadow over both the town and the men locked inside. The prison was notorious for its harsh conditions. Overcrowding, inadequate food, brutal guards, and a system that allowed for the abuse of inmates. As the years went on, the fear of Kingston Penitentiary grew. It wasn't just a prison, it was a symbol of the Canadian criminal justice system at its most unforgiving. The infamous, solitary confinement cells were where the worst of the worst were kept, isolated in a small, windowless room, sometimes for months on end. The mental toll it took was unbearable for many, but it was precisely what the system wanted. These solitary cells became synonymous with the horrors of Kingston. Even for the most hardened criminals, the thought of being locked away here was enough to break them. But the terror of Kingston wasn't confined to just the architecture and the system. It was the people, both the guards and the prisoners, who made it truly feared. One of the most infamous cases involved a series of brutal inmate-on-inmate attacks. According to news reports, in the late 1970s, an inmate named X became notorious for his violent actions. He was said to have attacked several fellow prisoners with such viciousness that the prison had to implement additional security measures. Inmates reported that X seemed almost untouchable, his power grew from the fear he instilled in others. His reign of terror left scars not only on the victims but on the entire prison. Inside these walls, survival often meant becoming something you never thought you would. It meant learning the unspoken rules, finding allies, and, for many, doing things that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Kingston Penitentiary continued to operate for over a century, but as the years passed, the reputation of the facility grew even more sinister. By the late 1990s, the prison was infamous across the world for its brutal history. The decision to close the penitentiary in 2013 wasn't just about outdated facilities, it was a recognition that this institution had become a symbol of the darkest aspects of Canada's prison system. Millhaven Institution, the cold heart of Ontario. As Kingston's gates shut for the last time, Millhaven Institution stood ready to take its place as one of Canada's most feared penitentiaries. Located just outside of Kingston, Millhaven quickly earned a reputation for being even more brutal than its predecessor. It was built in the 1970s as part of a wave of new high-security prisons, but from the start, it was clear that this would be a place where few would survive with their souls intact. Millhaven was known for housing the most violent criminals in Canada, including serial killers, drug lords, and men who had committed heinous crimes that shocked the nation. But it wasn't just the inmates who made Millhaven infamous, it was the prison system itself. Reports from former inmates paint a grim picture of life at Millhaven. Guards were known to be harsh, and the isolation was designed to break the spirit. The seg, short for segregation, unit became synonymous with despair. For many prisoners, this was their home for years, alone, with nothing but their thoughts. And for some, those thoughts were more terrifying than any external threat. The prison's role as a holding ground for the most dangerous people in Canada led to some chilling incidents. In the late 1990s, a notorious inmate named Paul Bernardo, known as the Ken and Barbie Killer, was held at Millhaven. His crimes, which included the brutal kidnapping, torture, and murder of 2 teenage girls, made him one of the most feared men in the country. His time at Millhaven became a constant reminder of the depths of violence that could be found within these walls. But it wasn't just Bernardo who made Millhaven infamous. According to court filings and investigative reports, there were multiple cases of violent outbreaks inside the prison. Fights broke out regularly between rival gangs, and in some cases, inmates took justice into their own hands. One of the most chilling reports came from a former inmate, who described a night when an inmate was stabbed in the middle of the night. The violence was so random, so brutal, that even the hardened criminals were left in shock. And then there were the stories of what happened behind closed doors, in the shadows where the prison guards couldn't see. These whispered stories have never been fully verified, but many former inmates claim that some of the guards were just as brutal as the criminals they oversaw. According to reports, there were several instances of guard-on-inmate violence that were never officially investigated. In the dark corners of Millhaven, a sense of lawlessness prevailed. Inmates lived with the constant threat of violence, and the very walls of the prison seemed to close in on them. But for all the darkness that surrounded Millhaven, it was never just the prison that struck fear into the hearts of those who entered, it was the people who came out of it. Edmonton Max, the unbroken prison. The cold air bites at your skin as the towering walls of Edmonton Max loom over you. It's a place where even the bravest men tremble before they step inside. From the moment you arrive, the sense of hopelessness is palpable, a feeling so thick it can almost suffocate you. Here, there are no illusions. This is a place where violence isn't just an unfortunate reality, it's the currency by which survival is bought. Edmonton Max, officially known as the Edmonton Institution for Women, is more than just a high-security facility. It is a fortress designed to break the human spirit. But over the decades, it became clear that the prisoners inside were far from broken. In fact, they became some of the most dangerous, cunning, and violent individuals to ever walk the Canadian prison system. This is the story of a place that became notorious for its cruelty, where guards and inmates lived in an unspoken agreement of terror. A place where violence ruled, and escape, both physically and mentally, was nearly impossible. The origins of Edmonton Max. Built in the early 1990s, Edmonton Max was designed to hold the worst of the worst, prisoners who had demonstrated violent tendencies, who posed a direct threat to others. Situated in the heart of Edmonton, Alberta, this maximum security prison was a grim place, surrounded by a cold and unforgiving city landscape. The prison's location was no accident, its isolation was deliberate, keeping its most dangerous inmates out of sight, locked away from society. What set Edmonton Max apart was its sheer intensity. It wasn't just about confinement, it was about punishment. The prison's design was specifically aimed at stripping away any semblance of freedom and instilling fear in the men who walked its halls. And it succeeded. Over the years, it became known as one of the most brutal and terrifying facilities in the country. The prison housed individuals who had committed violent crimes, some of Canada's most infamous criminals. Drug kingpins, mobsters, serial offenders, and even those with political motives found themselves behind Edmonton Max's walls. The reputation of the facility was such that even the most hardened criminals feared being sent there. But fear wasn't just born from the men inside, it was also rooted in the system that kept them there. The institution's security measures were unparalleled. Inmates were placed in solitary confinement for the smallest of infractions, and many of them were subjected to long periods of isolation. But the real cruelty lay in the mental toll this constant threat of violence and isolation took on the individuals inside. Life behind the walls. Prisoners locked away in Edmonton Max learned quickly that their safety depended on their ability to assert dominance. For many, that meant participating in or tolerating the violence that was an everyday part of life. But for some, it meant far worse. Inside these walls, survival often came down to brutality, and the institution was built to foster it. In the early years, violence among the inmates was a common occurrence. Fights were frequent, often erupting without warning. According to reports, many of the prisoners were gang members who continued their violent affiliations even while incarcerated. The most feared gang within the prison was the Alberta Wolf Pack, a notorious group of inmates who ruled the prison's underground. These men were feared not just by fellow prisoners but by the very guards who were supposed to maintain order. The atmosphere was one of constant tension. Inmates knew that the slightest misstep could result in an attack. According to unverified reports from former guards, there were many incidents where violence erupted without provocation, often because of the shifting alliances and rivalries between different factions within the prison. The prison was more than just a place of physical confinement, it was a psychological war zone, where trust was a commodity no one could afford. One particularly chilling account comes from an ex-prisoner, who recalled an incident in the late 1990s when a brutal fight broke out between two gang factions. The fight reportedly ended in the death of an inmate, and the chaos that ensued led to a lockdown that lasted for days. During the lockdown, guards were said to have taken extreme measures to prevent further violence, but these measures only escalated the tension. The brutality of the fight was etched into the memories of those who witnessed it. But it wasn't just the inmates who perpetuated the violence. Over the years, there have been numerous reports of guard brutality. According to several former inmates, the staff at Edmonton Max were notorious for using excessive force. They would use their authority to inflict physical punishment, and some former prisoners alleged that certain guards took pleasure in the suffering of those they controlled. These allegations, while unverified, were consistent with the harsh and often lawless environment within the prison. And then, there were the mental games. Many inmates who spent long periods in solitary confinement started to lose touch with reality. Some would talk to themselves, others would write incoherent letters, and some would even try to break out, only to be caught and placed back in solitary confinement. The psychological toll of being confined to such an unforgiving environment was enough to break even the toughest men. It's no wonder, then, that so many who entered Edmonton Max never came out the same. The infamous escapes. Despite its extreme security measures, Edmonton Max has been the site of several attempted escapes, a testament to the lengths inmates were willing to go to in order to break free from the hellish conditions inside. But those who attempted to escape often paid a steep price. One of the most famous escapes occurred in the early 2000s, when an inmate managed to slip past the guards and make a daring break for freedom. It was reported that the escapee, a member of the Alberta Wolf Pack, had planned the escape meticulously, using a combination of stolen tools and cunning to make it out of the prison. But his freedom didn't last long. Within hours, he was recaptured and brought back in chains, his escape becoming yet another chilling story to add to the prison's dark history. The story of this escape, however, was just one of many. Over the years, there have been numerous other escape attempts, some successful, others thwarted at the last minute. But the chilling truth remained, no one who tried to escape from Edmonton Max ever truly succeeded in leaving its grasp for good. This relentless cycle of violence, punishment, and failed escapes only further cemented Edmonton Max's reputation as one of the most feared places in Canada. A prison with no future. Despite its notorious status, Edmonton Max wasn't invincible. In recent years, there has been mounting pressure from both human rights organizations and the public to reform the prison system. Inmates continue to speak out about the conditions inside, claiming that the brutal methods employed by the prison system do more harm than good. And while many of these claims remain unverified, the stories from inside these walls speak for themselves. In 2020, a government commission was launched to investigate the state of prisons like Edmonton Max. While the commission found some improvements in the treatment of inmates, it also revealed that serious issues persisted. Overcrowding, inadequate mental health care, and the continued use of solitary confinement were just a few of the problems highlighted. And yet, despite all of this, Edmonton Max remains standing. Though the future of the institution is uncertain, its legacy as one of the most feared and brutal prisons in Canada remains intact. The final chapter. Edmonton Max is more than just a prison. It is a symbol of the darkness that can be found within the human soul, a place where survival is bought with blood, and hope is nothing more than a distant memory. For the men who have been sent there, it is a place where the worst parts of themselves are brought to the forefront, and for the public, it remains a constant reminder of the harsh realities of the criminal justice system. Millhaven Institution. Where the darkness lives. There are places in the world that seem designed to strip away every last shred of humanity. Millhaven Institution is one of those places. Situated just outside of Kingston, Ontario, this maximum security prison is not just a place of incarceration, it's a place where the most dangerous and violent individuals are locked away, hidden from society. And inside its towering walls, life is a constant fight for survival, with an atmosphere so thick with fear and despair, it suffocates even the strongest. Since its opening in 1971, Millhaven has built a reputation for brutality. It isn't just the violence that makes it infamous, it's the isolation, the unrelenting pressure, the psychological toll it takes on those forced to call it home. If Kingston Penitentiary was the birthplace of Canada's prison nightmares, Millhaven is where those nightmares evolved into something darker, something even more terrifying. The harsh reality of Millhaven's walls. From the outside, Millhaven looks like any other penitentiary, an imposing, grey structure with high fences and barbed wire surrounding it. But step inside, and you're immediately hit by the cold, impersonal nature of the place. The hallways are stark, the walls are unadorned, and the air feels heavy, as if the very building itself is weighed down by the suffering of those locked within. The prison's design was intended to reflect its purpose, to house only the worst offenders. The men sent to Millhaven were often criminals of the highest order, those who had committed unspeakable acts, those who had no place in society. But it was more than just the type of criminals housed here that made Millhaven infamous. It was the way the prison operated. One of the most chilling aspects of Millhaven was its reputation for harsh and punitive conditions. Prisoners were kept in near-complete isolation, especially those in the notorious segregation units. These cells, some no larger than a small closet, were designed to break the spirits of the men who were placed there. Without windows, and often deprived of human contact for days or even weeks, the inmates quickly began to lose touch with reality. Reports from former inmates paint a disturbing picture of life in the segregation units. Many of them spoke of hearing voices, seeing things that weren't there, and feeling trapped in a constant state of anxiety and fear. And even outside of segregation, the conditions at Millhaven were harsh. The overcrowding, the inadequate medical care, and the complete lack of any meaningful rehabilitation programs created a toxic environment that only bred more violence and despair. According to court filings and investigative reports, there were instances where inmates were forced to endure physical violence from prison guards. In some cases, these guards were accused of using excessive force to maintain control, pushing inmates past the point of pain into the realm of cruelty. While these reports are not always verified, they paint a portrait of a prison that was less concerned with rehabilitation and more focused on maintaining control at any cost. Violence and reprisal. Millhaven's reputation as a violent prison didn't come from rumors, it was based on real events that played out behind the institution's steel doors. Inmates often lived in constant fear of being attacked, either by their fellow prisoners or by the guards who were supposed to protect them. One of the most notorious incidents in Millhaven's history took place in 1986, when an inmate, identified in reports only as B, was involved in a violent confrontation with another prisoner. According to multiple sources, B had been in and out of Millhaven for years, a known gang member with a history of violent behavior. One fateful day, he got into a fight with another inmate over a trivial dispute. What happened next would become one of the darkest chapters in the prison's history. The fight quickly escalated into a full-blown brawl, with multiple inmates getting involved. But what made this incident particularly chilling was the way it ended. B fatally stabbed his opponent, leaving him to bleed out on the cold concrete floor. In the chaos that followed, guards intervened, but by then, it was too late. The violence at Millhaven had claimed another victim. The death sent shockwaves through the prison, but it was far from an isolated incident. Reports from other prisoners describe a culture of violence where retaliation was common. Gangs controlled much of the prison's underground economy, and anyone who stepped out of line faced swift retribution. For many inmates, survival meant aligning with one of the many factions within the prison, each one operating under its own brutal set of rules. But even the gang leaders weren't immune to the violence of Millhaven. According to reports, one of the most feared gang leaders in the prison system, known only as K, was found dead in his cell under mysterious circumstances. While no one could prove exactly how he died, the suspicion was that it was a targeted hit, executed by his own former allies in the prison's power struggle. In a place like Millhaven, trust was a fleeting thing, and betrayal was the price one paid for survival. The psychological toll. Perhaps what makes Millhaven truly terrifying isn't just the violence, it's the toll it takes on the human mind. The constant fear, the unrelenting isolation, and the ever-present threat of death or injury wear down even the strongest individuals. For inmates who spent long periods of time in Millhaven, the psychological toll was immense. Many prisoners reported experiencing deep depression, anxiety, and hallucinations after years of confinement. The lack of meaningful human interaction and the brutal conditions of the prison slowly but surely chipped away at their mental health. One former inmate, John, a pseudonym, spent over a decade in Millhaven. His account, shared with a documentary crew years after his release, painted a haunting picture of the psychological strain that the prison imposed. John described how, in his early years, he tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, speaking to fellow inmates and attempting to keep his mind sharp. But the constant violence, coupled with the isolation, eventually broke him. "I would hear voices in my cell, sometimes it was just the wind, but other times it felt like people were watching me," John said, his voice trembling as he recounted his memories. "You learn to live with it. You either shut down, or you survive. And surviving meant becoming someone you're not." He wasn't alone. Countless others reported similar experiences, and for many, the lasting effects of their time at Millhaven lingered long after their release. Even after being freed from the prison's gates, the shadows of the institution remained. For some, the scars weren't just physical, they were emotional and psychological, scars that would never fully heal. The closing of Millhaven's dark legacy. As the years went on, the government began to take a closer look at the state of Canada's prisons, including Millhaven. There was growing concern about the conditions inside, the treatment of inmates, and the overall effectiveness of the prison system. Despite the prison's violent history, it wasn't until 2019 that the government officially closed Millhaven's doors for good, citing the institution's outdated facilities and failure to comply with evolving standards of human rights. But for those who had spent time inside, the closure of Millhaven didn't erase the memories. It didn't undo the pain, the violence, or the darkness that had permeated every corner of the prison. For the men who had lived through it, Millhaven would always remain a symbol of Canada's criminal justice system at its most unforgiving. The legacy of Millhaven. Though it has been shut down, the legacy of Millhaven still looms large in the minds of many. It was a prison that pushed people to their breaking points, a place where survival often meant becoming something you never thought you'd be. The men who came out of Millhaven were never quite the same, many struggled with the psychological scars of their time there, and some even carried the violence of the institution with them long after their release. Millhaven is no longer a functioning penitentiary, but its story, the story of a place where humanity was stripped away, lives on. For the men who were sent there, it will always be a part of them. And for Canada, it serves as a grim reminder of what can happen when the system becomes more about punishment than rehabilitation. Conclusion. The story of Millhaven, much like the other infamous prisons we've covered, is not just a tale of criminals and guards. It's a reflection of a system that, at times, seems to forget the very essence of humanity. It's a place where the human spirit is tested, broken, and reshaped by the unrelenting force of fear, violence, and isolation. The new era of Canadian prisons, a system in transition. The heavy gates of Canada's most notorious prisons have closed, but the system remains. Behind the walls, the stories of violence, suffering, and isolation still echo, leaving a trail of scars that will never fade. But as Canada turns a page on its history of brutal penitentiaries like Kingston Penitentiary, Millhaven, and Edmonton Max, the question remains, can a new era of correctional facilities truly change the landscape of criminal justice in the country? Can rehabilitation be more than just a buzzword, or will these new prisons merely be different shades of the same harsh reality? Canada's correctional system has long been criticized for its failure to rehabilitate, for the unrelenting cruelty of its maximum security prisons. The question that haunts policymakers and reform advocates alike is whether a system that was built on punishment can evolve into one that focuses on healing and reintegration into society. In this final chapter, we explore the current transformation of Canada's prison system. As the nation grapples with its past and attempts to forge a new path forward, we take a close look at what's changed, and what, if anything, has truly been reformed. The shift from punishment to rehabilitation. For years, Canada's prison system was driven by a simple, unforgiving philosophy: lock them up and throw away the key. High-security institutions like Millhaven and Kingston were built to break their inmates. The goal was punishment, not rehabilitation. And for those unlucky enough to be sent there, that meant years of trauma, both physical and psychological. But in recent years, there's been a shift in the rhetoric surrounding Canadian prisons. Reforms began to be introduced, aimed at addressing the flaws of a system that had long been criticized for failing to rehabilitate offenders. These reforms were part of a growing understanding that prisons should not only house criminals but also help them reintegrate into society. The rehabilitation model was slowly gaining traction, with an emphasis on providing inmates with the tools to reintegrate into society, rather than simply punishing them. This meant new approaches to education, mental health care, substance abuse treatment, and employment training. For the first time in decades, the focus shifted toward a more humane approach to incarceration, one that took into account the complexities of criminal behavior and sought to address the root causes of crime. The introduction of correctional facilities designed with rehabilitation in mind marked the beginning of a new era. These prisons were intended to break the cycle of violence and despair that had defined the old maximum security institutions. They were meant to provide inmates with the tools they needed to rebuild their lives. But can this shift truly change the system? Will these reforms be enough to overcome the dark legacy of places like Millhaven and Kingston Penitentiary? The construction of new prisons, a vision of hope. The construction of new correctional facilities across Canada is a testament to the nation's commitment to prison reform. One of the first steps in this process was the creation of the new super prisons, high-security facilities built with a focus on rehabilitation rather than pure containment. These new institutions are designed to be more humane and focused on rehabilitation. Inmates are given access to vocational training, education programs, and psychological counseling to address the underlying causes of their behavior. They are also encouraged to participate in therapy programs aimed at anger management, substance abuse, and violence prevention. Take, for example, the new St. Lawrence Valley Correctional Facility in Ontario. This prison, which opened its doors in 2017, is one of the first of its kind in Canada. Unlike its predecessors, which were designed primarily to house violent criminals, St. Lawrence focuses on rehabilitation and reintegration into society. The facility features programs aimed at treating substance abuse, mental illness, and other factors that contribute to criminal behavior. Inmates are given the opportunity to earn their high school diploma or even a college degree, with some going on to participate in job training programs in fields such as carpentry, culinary arts, and information technology. The goal is to provide inmates with the skills they need to find stable employment once they are released. But these efforts aren't without their critics. Some argue that rehabilitation programs in Canadian prisons are nothing more than window dressing, designed to placate the public without addressing the systemic issues that continue to plague the criminal justice system. While the intention behind these reforms is noble, there are concerns about whether they can truly undo the damage caused by years of punishment-driven policies. The mental health crisis. One of the most pressing issues in Canada's prison system is the mental health crisis that affects a significant portion of the inmate population. Inmates who are incarcerated often suffer from mental health disorders that are not adequately addressed by the correctional system. Conditions such as depression, anxiety, PTSD, and schizophrenia are common among those behind bars, yet the treatment available is often insufficient. In the old institutions, such as Millhaven and Kingston, mental health care was practically non-existent. Inmates who struggled with psychological disorders were often placed in solitary confinement, where their conditions worsened. The isolation only deepened their mental health issues, creating a vicious cycle that was almost impossible to break. The new focus on rehabilitation, however, has led to some improvements in how the correctional system addresses mental health. In the newly designed facilities, mental health care is more integrated into the daily lives of inmates. Mental health professionals are now part of the staff, and therapy is available for those who need it. Inmates with mental health issues are more likely to receive the help they need, whether that be through counseling, medication, or group therapy sessions. While these changes represent a step forward, many believe the system still has a long way to go. Experts argue that Canada's correctional system is ill-equipped to handle the growing number of inmates with mental health issues. The lack of specialized care and resources means that many prisoners continue to suffer without the proper treatment. The challenge lies in providing comprehensive mental health services that can address the root causes of criminal behavior, while also ensuring the safety of both inmates and staff. The shadow of the past. While the Canadian correctional system is evolving, the shadow of its past remains. The legacy of prisons like Kingston and Millhaven continues to haunt the system, shaping the way many view prison reform. For those who spent years inside these institutions, the trauma of the past is something that cannot be easily forgotten. And for those who remain incarcerated in the system, the fear of returning to a place like Millhaven. A place where violence was the norm and rehabilitation was an afterthought, still looms large. In some ways, the past may never fully be erased. The damage caused by years of neglect, brutality, and abuse can't simply be swept away with a few new programs or a change in prison design. The road to true reform is long, and the scars of Canada's prison system will remain, etched into the memories of those who lived through it. Yet, there is hope. The changes taking place are not without their challenges, but they represent an important step in the right direction. By focusing on rehabilitation, mental health, and education, Canada is creating a new kind of prison system, one that strives to be more humane and more effective. And while the battle for prison reform is far from over, there are signs that change is possible. Looking forward, a system in flux. Canada's prison system is at a crossroads. The brutal institutions of the past are slowly being replaced with new facilities designed to rehabilitate, not just punish. But the question remains, will this new era of prison reform be enough to fundamentally change the way Canada handles crime and punishment? Can a system built on violence and isolation truly transform into one that fosters healing and redemption? As Canada continues to grapple with these questions, the future of its correctional system remains uncertain. But one thing is clear, the journey toward a more just and humane prison system has only just begun. This story is far from over. The final chapter in the history of Canada's prison system is still being written. Stay tuned as we continue to track the progress of prison reform in Canada, and whether these changes will truly create a safer, more rehabilitative system for all.